Welcome to the second video of our tutorial series for how to build services for the IIP-Ecosphere platform. Here we're talking about how to configure these services. This is, like I said, the second step in the process, and we will configure basic service attributes and the logging. So some prerequisites for this: you should either have installed the platform and a fitting Eclipse provided by us or using the development container. The Eclipse is optional, as you will just miss color coding and some quality of life attributes if you use your own Eclipse for this. And you should know how to configure data types, as we will be using or at least referring to them in this part. Optional, you could look at the introduction to code generation, because it shines some light on how the files we are working with interact and what they do. So the first and only step in this tutorial is configuring the services. First, what is a service? So we have, to explain this, an image of an example application in this slide. It's a selection of services chained together. The first service, a source service, is just responsible for getting data in a certain format and then passing this on in the, let's say, internal format, and then passing it on in another format that's fitting for the further working of other services. It might be that you can reuse your, for example, source service, because you know the data source and you know also that the output is again needed in the same way. Then you have a transformer service, which will receive a certain data type with different data points, transform this in some way and pass it on to the next service. And the sync service, which will just end this process for an application by doing something with the data. This would be outputting, saving, just somehow reacting to it, or nothing, if that's what's needed. The YAML files to configure these services and the application can be found in the source test easy directory, and it is one of the YAML files. So what do we need to deal with? Which files are relevant? Potentially most of them. Realistically, only the services. So the application part file will mostly be relevant for the service mesh, which could be influenced by our services. And we will get to this in an upcoming video. The service mesh is influenced by the names of our services. This all service part Python file is the one we will be mostly working with. And we might need to look into the data types file in case we forgot about a name, and these will be relevant to defining the output for our services. Lastly, we might need to look in the technical setup, but the technical setup is mostly relevant for the installation. And you define your services, like I mentioned, the all service part file, and on the bottom I have an example of how this might look for a Java service, in this case named source. We have a service type, which in this case is the Java service, the other one is Python service. And this is just the only distinction we make. One could create more services if one really wants to extend the models for this, but this is beyond this tutorial. We have an ID. This is the ID or the name the service will show up as when using the command line interface to interact with it. We have a class that defines where the Java file for this service is located. This will, pre-generation, also define the package path this file will be located in. So in this case, you would go through DE, IIP-Ecosphere Platform, impl, shop, and then a test source. Class is only relevant for Java services. Python services do not have a class. Furthermore, we have an artifact, which is the same for all services in our tutorial. It refers to the Maven artifact, where the class can be found. So this will be where the templates, the generated templates, will be generated to when you install these artifacts. The correct value for this can be found by looking at the Maven group ID and the artifact ID shown in the POM file of your template project, which you also will see in a future video when we get to the generation of the templates. This does not need to be the same for every service you're using in an application. Just for this example, as it's referring to some Maven artifact, you could theoretically also refer to another service you want to reuse in your current application. So this can actually be different for each of them, but for the sake of simplicity and when you're working with the templates, it will probably be the same for each service. The last thing is the service kind. The kind defines what the service does, so we distinguish between source, sync, and transformer. Now, to define init output, you might need to look at your data types you've defined in the first part. Output is the data type the service passes on. So after processing, in a source service, we already have an output because it only passes on data. Input would be right below it or right above it, looking the same with another data type. It's the data type that's passed into the service from another service. Sources only have output data as they pass data on, as in things that only have input data as they take data and the process ends there. Transformers have in and output data as they're in the middle of the process somewhere. The next part to care about is asynchronous, which defines if a service acts synchronous or asynchronous. A synchronous service needs to pass on data the moment it receives it, so receive, work with it, pass it on. An asynchronous service does not necessarily need to do this, so you have a bit more freedom in that regard. We have the trace kinds. These are meant to log the behavior of your services. There are multiples like trace kind none, trace kind log, trace kind trace, and trace kind system out. Logging uses a specific logging framework. Trace uses an AES to store the data. And what we're using for this example is system out, as it's printed directly to the terminal, and you can read what your service is supposed to do. Also nice for testing. Trace send has basically the same values than trace receive. On this slide we see an example for a Python service. This is just to show that this isn't too much different from a Java service when creating one. One of the main differences between a Python and a Java service is the kind. A Python service can only have transformation service as a kind, as we don't support Python source or things right now. Any further information on how to build with a Python service will be in a separate video on how to build an application with Python service as well as AI. What you should have learned is how to configure your services. You should have seen where the things are you want to edit and why you would want to edit them. And how you now go on is how to configure a whole application from your services ongoing. Then how to build the application and how to test the application.